event. I hope that, can you hear me okay back there?
Yeah.
Good? Okay. I hope that you've all had a really nice time connecting with each other and learning some new things and meeting friends old and new. My name is Tao Orion, and I am a permaculture teacher, designer, consultant with my company Resilience Permaculture Design. I live just south of here, outside of Cottage Grove, Oregon, on the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. And I'm here today to talk to you about the concept of the commons and thinking about different ways that we can relate with land and each other. Because I feel like the kind of intersecting series of crises that we're currently experiencing and potentially coming more into as a culture has its root in some very specific events and patterns and concepts. And I feel like by exploring them, namely the root of capitalism and the economic system that we're existing within right now, we can start to kind of unthread this big ball of yarn and hopefully potentially start to weave something new, different, and more beautiful, just regenerative. So I've been interested in this kind of intersection of land and people and how we relate to landscapes for many years. So a few years ago, wrote the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species, a Permaculture Approach to Ecosystem Restoration. I became very interested in that study, just thinking about the way that we think about plants and landscapes and the meaning of wilderness and how some of those concepts of pristine nature are ones that kind of came from a Eurocentric perspective. So as a white person myself, I've spent some time and energy researching kind of the origins of that philosophy, and I find that it's threaded in with this discussion about capitalism and where we're at today. So I feel like it's important to kind of look at that as well. So I'm going to be weaving all of these interesting threads together. And as I mentioned, we all know that we're kind of at this precipice today. You know, there's a lot of focus on climate change at the particular moment. There's been the climate strike recently. The school strikes have been going on for the last year or so. But as probably all of us in this room know, there's more than just carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going on. We have degradation of ecosystems in the name of forestry and agriculture, mining, urban development, suburban sprawl, etc. Plastic pollution, overconsumption, all of these different things are happening at the same time, and they all have a similar root. And so in order to think about the climate crisis, we really have to think about all of these intersecting factors. And I came upon this quote from the author recently passed, Ursula Le Guin, a few years ago, and it really made me think in a new way about the economic system, capitalist system that we live in. Because, you know, she kind of names it as just a thing that we're living within, but just like the divine right of kings, it's not something that's inescapable. It's something that we can imagine our way out of. It's something that is a creation of humans. We make it, we've made it, and we remake it every day, but we can also continue to participate in patterns that unmake it and make a new world that doesn't depend on exploitation of ecosystems, other people, other species. And I think, you know, as permaculture folks, these are the kinds of things that we're working on every day. So one of my studies, as I mentioned, you know, my ancestors came from Europe. as I kind of like dug into that history for my own self, what I've come to realize is that the origins of capitalism came from Europe. So this is an economic system that is part of my heritage, but it was based on removing people from their land who had a kind of stewardship-based, community-based lifestyle. Prior to the development of industrial capitalism in England, it primarily started in England, around the 14 or 1500s, people were mostly living in small villages and had kind of small private plots of home garden scale production, but their fields for animals and large grains and pulses, things like that, were all managed as a commons. So people were working together to grow the things that are really hard to grow as an individual family unit. And this was pretty much the case all throughout Europe, and indeed in various different forms it was the case all over the world. People have been getting together and figuring out how to manage their commonly used resources forever. That's how we naturally, I think, want to engage with each other. It's not always an idyllic, like, oh, this is just great and everybody's getting along. There are rules and there are things that have to be worked out. But in general, before profit was a big motive and taking resources and putting them in the hands of just a few people who are said to be owners of it, that's pretty much how people have been doing things on the planet. Around the 1400s, 1500s in England, there became an interest in taking that land that was, in name at least, owned by the ruling classes of that time, the aristocracy, and taking the common land and enclosing it. So there was a process of enclosure, and what this entailed was driving people off of the land that they had been living on for hundreds, thousands of years, and mostly putting it towards sheep production for wool. So wool became one of the major engines of the Industrial Revolution. So over the next couple of hundred years, factories sprang up to start processing the wool. England became a really big exporter of fabric for their newly minted colonies. So as this process kind of expanded, and there was a need for labor, for people to work in the factories. And so it was kind of this parallel movement of dispossessing people from the land, creating a class of people that were the wage workers, so kind of severing that relationship. And this process was also tied in with the witch burnings that were a major feature of European history from the 1300s pretty much up through the 1800s. If you ever read the work of Sylvia Federici, who wrote Caliban and the Witch and Re-Enchanting the World, she's an amazing historian. And one of the things that she kind of pieces out was this process of enclosure and dispossessing people of their land in Europe was very much tied to devaluing the work of women, in particular in that time frame, and creating a situation in which, in that traditional household scenario, the man would go out to work in the factory, the woman would be home. Before the enclosure, it was a more egalitarian kind of scenario where there were a lot of different roles and responsibilities shared in the household. So there's a lot of really interesting history here with the enclosure movements. So you can see this is a picture of the UK, and here up in the upper right it says enclosed by 1700, over 70% of the land in green. by 1700, 50 to 70% of the land had been enclosed, so that means people had been dispossessed off of it, and it had been turned into large estates where one owner was running thousands of sheep. And you start to see this development of the cityscape. So London, the population suddenly swelled. This was also happening all throughout mainland Europe. And as I mentioned, the idea of the witch, when you look through this history, it wasn't just women who were killed by the hundreds of thousands. We're not talking about just, a few here and there. This was a concerted effort to essentially take out the people who were consistently and in some cases, unequivocally uprising against the efforts of the church and state to dispossess them of their land. And this happened over the course of hundreds of years. There were several uprisings. There were several different bands of people who were like, no, this is not happening. This is what we want. We want to live in an egalitarian society. This is back in like the 1400s. But for the most part, those people were eliminated, or they went underground. And so that history lives on in Europe. And those that were successful and profited off of that process, again, multi-generational trauma there for people living in that context, abandoned villages, people moving to cities, things like vagrancy laws becoming the norm where you couldn't be out on the street, the rise of police also kind of started in that era. From there, the major colonial powers started seeking their resources elsewhere. So they enclosed everywhere in Britain, France, Germany, kind of happened all throughout Europe. And then it was time to go out. And the whole kind of trajectory of colonization and the idea behind it was that you would go out, colonize a particular place, take the natural resources back to the center of manufacturing, which was in Europe, make the goods, the value-added products like cloth or like rum, things like that, and then sell them back to the colonies. So you're profiting at every turn. So this was the setup, and to some extent it still is the setup, that the countries that were able to have that wealth, because of, again, this major dispossession of landed people for the hundreds of years leading up to the decision to start doing the colonization process, those powers had that money. And what's happened from there, it spread all over the world, as we know. I found this graphic pretty interesting, just to watch the slow spread of not only European interests, like economic interests, although that was the major driving factor, but also just that philosophical framework and the idea of supremacy and the idea of just that those people had the right to go to these lands and take what they wanted and then keep on with that. Yeah?
What do the colors mean that we're looking at? The red and the green.
So here we have Imperial European Nation, the dark green, lighter green European Colony, European Protectorate, occupied by European Nation, is a sea green here, autonomous colony, self-government. So you can see it kind of changes over time as well, because they've had different statuses since the process began. In personal union with or dominion of European nation, and then claimed by European nation was the white.
So basically the whole world.
So basically the whole world. I know, when I came up on this, I was like, well, it's a little long, but it kind of shows in a very clear way. What was that?
Find the graphic somewhere?
Yes, and I'll post this on my website, and maybe I can email it. I'm not sure if there's a common space to
Yes,
post
yes,
it. Okay.
yes.
Sorry, what was that? Oh, okay. So, we're getting closer to the modern times. But what you can basically see here is that the origins of that economic model spread throughout the world. We're still living in that context, and with all of the trauma and horror that caused all over the world. And, you know, reckoning with this is not going to be any easy task, because many of us who are involved in decolonization work, anti-racist work, anti-white supremacy work, know it's, you know, this is going to be a very long-term process to try to untangle the effects of what happened here. And, you know, just to know the scale of what was lost in many of these colonial endeavors. You know, there were highly functional communities and managing landscapes at a high level of diversity that we can only begin to imagine now. For me, as a permaculture person, I've become very interested in traditional land management systems and have endeavored to learn as much as I can about what agriculture looked like in the Willamette Valley prior to colonization. You know, it's working with fire primarily is the big tool that was used around here, as well as ruminants like elk and deer. Were kind of the major features, and you know, those are things that we can't really engage in the same way, largely because of private property considerations. So one of the things that happened, as I mentioned, that enclosure process of changing over commons type land management, that was also practiced here in North America to a greater or lesser extent. And one of the ways that at least when the European interests came to the east coast of the United States, I kind of looked at some of that history of how they justified taking land from people who were obviously engaged over the long term, having large agricultural communities, cities, you know, obviously owning their land in the best sense of the term. The way that they justified it, and this was like written in newspapers from, you know, Jamestown, you know, back in the 1670s or whatever, is that the land was not enclosed, it was not fenced. There were no rock walls around their gardens. And, you know, people didn't have paper titles to their piece of land. And so basically, and you know, there was a big kind of discussion back and forth at a certain time, like, is it really ethical to take all this land from the Native Americans? Back and forth between the aristocracy of mostly England at that time and some of the colonists who were in the United States, and being like, well, you know, we don't really feel that good about this. But some people were like, well, you know, they have like a civil right to the land. This is what was actually decided as the legal basis for, you know, moving out across the United States and taking all of the land of the indigenous people. They have a civil right to the land, but they don't have a legal right to the land. So, and again, this happened everywhere. Yeah?
And the doctrine of discovery, which I won't go into, but was used as recently as 2005 by the United States Supreme Court to maintain land ownership over New York, a current, where a tribe that was in the state of what we call New York now.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me given, what we've seen here. And, it came up in the decolonizing permaculture workshop lately, or earlier, what should we, or how can we engage in this process now, reckoning with this land, stolen land, and, what is that process going to look like? And I think that that's something that we really need to be thinking about. Again, it's not going to have a simple answer. I'm going to talk about a few things later in the presentation that could potentially help with that situation. And just to say that commons-based land rights and tenure are the norm still. Today, many systems still survive the process of colonization. They've been changed and adapted to some extent, but many people in many places are still practicing what they can, even in this context of continued enclosure of land. It's not just land, but it's water, it's air. Now we're starting to see, with the CO2 in the atmosphere, you can think about it that way. I'll just point out one that you may be familiar with. This is a picture of Switzerland, and all of, or not all, but a good portion of the alpine meadows in the Alps are actually managed as a commons. And so farmers, ranchers, I'm not sure what they're called exactly there, but they will bring their cows up to the upper pastures and allow them to graze all together. And they kind of know whose cows are whose and bring them back down. Also, throughout Indonesia and Southeast Asia, where people are mostly small-scale fishermen or fisher people, there are many commons-based resource management approaches that people use there. So they create their own kind of bottom-up regulations, ways of relating with the resource that makes sense based on very localized context. Like, this is what works here, this is how we decided to move forward with rulemaking for each other. It's not a state-driven process. So I've been really getting into learning more about these systems because I feel like they have a lot to teach us. And I also like to think about this idea that we probably all heard about, the tragedy of the commons. I know when I was in Environmental Studies 101 in college, we read this essay, and it was like, oh yeah, we can't manage land in common because everybody's just out for their own self-interest, and we'll just keep adding more and more cows until there's no pasture left. To me, that sounds like something that's coming from that kind of philosophical mindset of appropriation and just taking and not reciprocating, not giving back. And indeed, when you look into who the author was, Garrett Hardin, he wrote that essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. He was actually a proponent of eugenics. He was a proponent of building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border way back in the day, in like the 60s and 70s. He actually never studied or interacted with people who managed their land in common. He was not engaged in that type of research at all. He was just kind of like in this theoretical idea. And maybe it would happen if people really are out for their own self-interest and just trying to get the last buck out of every, square inch of land that they can. But it's a very capitalist argument, and that it kind of permeates still much of the kind of conservation ideology. The idea that people can and do steward land together without the idea of maximizing profit, but with the idea of maximizing livelihood outcomes, is something that we really need to be thinking about more. And so I've been studying more about Elinor Ostrom, who's an actual Nobel Prize winning economist who studied extensively over the course of her career people who manage their land and resources as a commons. And so after observing all of these different things, from irrigation ditches in Sri Lanka to the fisheries in Southeast Asia to the Swiss cow herd movement that I mentioned, and many other examples, she found that there were these 8 patterns or rules that people generally make use of as they manage their commons. So I'll just read them quickly. Define clear group boundaries. So who is and who isn't a part of using this particular resource. I know that term is kind of problematic, so I've been endeavoring as a writer and just thinking about these things to think about a different word, but for now we'll use that word resource. And that's where, thinking back to those maps of indigenous territories, like you can kind of see where that came from if you can kind of define your space and say, well, it's not like this is a private property and none shall pass, but there is a sense of, generally these are the hunting grounds that we utilize. And if you are passing through and you need to do that, well, that's cool, but just let us know. That kind of thing makes sense. Match rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. And so this is, again, thinking about those very local contexts that are super site specific. They might be different in a different watershed. And I think that's one of the places where this kind of state level, especially conservation approaches, kind of tends to fail, is that it's kind of trying to create this blanket approach and saying, well, you can harvest this much of this, and we're going to give you a lottery ticket, to harvest this. It's not necessarily a locally adapted approach. And then following, ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. This is a big one for us because for those of you who kind of engage in politics or have attempted that, it can be hard to modify the rules, although it's not impossible. We definitely do have some leverage within our system currently to modify the rules. But I really like thinking about things in this way because it kind of provides a from the ground up context of people who have a stake in this stewardship are really creating the system by which it's stewarded. Make sure the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. This is one that, especially because her research has been in the past few decades, this has become really pertinent for people that are actually engaging with the state and trying to say, actually we've got this. You don't need to impose further rules or sanctions on us because we are regulating this resource. Develop a system carried out by community members for monitoring members' behavior and use graduated sanctions for rule violators. Provide accessible low-cost means for dispute resolution. It's interesting reading Ostrom's work because, it's not just like this thing, it's like a perfect utopian thing where everybody's getting along. As I mentioned before, people are still disagreeing, people are still, having different opinions about how things should work, and that we should expect and anticipate that. It's okay to disagree, but so we have to have these kind of in place to ensure that, things move forward appropriately. Build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. And that, to me, that's kind of provides this level of vision about how this could really work in the future as we kind of envision that system past capitalism if we can start to see ourselves doing this kind of engagement with each other and with our local regions, it could really start to expand from the ground up. Did you have a question?
Well, just one of the flaws of the original concept of the commons is that it was incomplete. You could own the stream bank, but no one owned the stream. You could own the grass, but no one owned the air. And so there was incomplete. And so that last point where it says from the lowest level up kind of infinitely divides the commons, doesn't it?
Yeah, that is interesting because some of that, I don't know if you heard his comment, but the private property idea that carried over from Europe was based on land only. And so you could own up to the stream bank, but you don't own the stream. And even now, so where I live on a creek, my property adjoins a creek, and those are all considered waters of the state. So they have a different ownership, which is essentially like a commons, but it's very differently regulated. And so I don't have the ability to necessarily engage with my neighbors on this level of, hey, this creek used to flow year-round 30 years ago, and now it's drying up. What are we going to do about that? That's the kind of thing that I think we should be moving forward with, and I hope to be having that conversation with my neighbors soon. So I think it's important to just say that without these rules in place and with profit as a motive, it's easy to see how it can become a tragedy. And I think, as we start to envision this new system, thinking about how we can engage in a way that isn't driven by money and is instead driven by our shared goals of having healthy, happy, meaningful lives. And what would that look like? And I'll just say that this process of enclosure is ongoing. We see in some of the more recent contexts have been development of big dam projects that are sanctioned by the state via the IMF or the World Bank that are creating, displacing people off of their land, claiming that as the right-of-way of the state, but then the power that's generated by the dams is put into factories where those people who are displaced off of their land then work. And so it's often couched as a development scheme, so lifting people out of what's considered poverty, when really, if you look closely, it may actually be subsistence and not really needing to rely on the wage economy, which is, I think it's important to start switching that lens around when we're, especially if you work in that field of so-called development. What are we really helping to create for people? Is it something that they're wanting to create? Do people really want to have a job working 40, 50, 60 hours a week in a factory? I don't know. And I think, just to qualify that a bit, I think at this point a lot of people are forced into really hard situations because the money economy has become the primary driver. And you can't just kind of go off on your own, and it's not as easy to just be a subsistence farmer. It really takes these community networks. So, there's some examples where people are doing that, but we'll do this one. As we kind of have come through the past 500 years or so, looking at our economic system as one that continues to, by design, enclose our cultural and also natural resource wealth. If we can start to kind of see things in that way, I think it's important as we start to envision what it could be instead. We don't have to just allow these things to transpire all around us. And so, for me, that's why when I think about climate change, I'm really thinking about system change. Because, if we think about the climate as a commons, or the atmosphere as a commons, all of the CO2 that's been put into the air, that's been benefiting very few people in terms of money. But that's something that we all share in, and we're all going to be, already are adapting to the effects of having that in the environment. And so, I feel like for the past several years I've been really interested in thinking about mitigation and, how are we going to draw down carbon, and I think that that's incredibly important still. But I really like to kind of shift the lens a bit and really, or I guess push the ball forward in terms of thinking about this as a bigger issue, multifaceted, that we can be moving on. And I found this interesting map as well. As we think about the effects of colonization, how that's played out, and now we're starting to see the effects of climate change. And this is a project where researchers were attempting to quantify vulnerability to changes in the climate, including loss of agricultural productivity, droughts, floods, coastal erosion, storm surges, sea level rise, things like that, extreme weather events. And interestingly, a lot of the most vulnerable places are many of those that were also on that map of colonization. And so many of these places, their resource wealth was taken and concentrated in North America and Europe. And now in where we live today, our government, even though, at this point it's not spending the kind of money that it could to invest in adapting and mitigating climate change, we do have money to do that. And it is going to take money to do some of the things that need to be done. But I think, to me, this is really an important consideration as well, because there are many billions of people who are going to be feeling the effects and impacts of climate change much more acutely than we are here. And kind of navigating the best ways of engaging with assisting in that, I think, is a really important series of conversations to be had as well. So I wanted to share a few resources that I found inspiring recently that have kind of started to meld all of these different topics, from colonization, indigenous knowledge, how we got to where we are today, the kind of the philosophical framework of capitalism versus some other system that we, as of yet, don't know yet, that I think we're all engaged in creating in our own ways. Call of the Reed Warbler. Has anybody read this book? It's a really great book. It's about Australia. It's a farmer, sheep rancher from Australia, a white guy, and he kind of, after years of managing his land conventionally, he starts to just kind of have this awakening about what happened to the indigenous people where he lived, and he goes on this kind of quest to figure out the actual history of his land and how his family came to obtain it and what that meant for the ecosystem. And he's like looking around, he's like, oh, I used to play by this skeleton of this 300, it was 300 years old when it died, this big ironwood tree. And I never really realized what it was, but there were these bark scrapings there. And he brought an indigenous elder to his property, and the person was like, oh yeah, that's where the women would come up and scrape the bark to make this particular type of rope, and you can still see the scars in the tree, even though the tree had died, 70 years before. So he just starts to kind of have this eye-opening experience, and then change his agriculture to kind of mirror that, and then he goes around and looks at all of these other people who are really starting to kind of wrap these threads together. So I find it really inspiring. Another one that just came out, also from Australia. Australia is, even though it wasn't on the map as being especially vulnerable, at least in an economic sense, climate change-wise, it's going to be, it already is experiencing salinization of the water table. The drought, the dry center is kind of moving out towards the coast. Really extreme temperatures are starting to become more common. So I think it's at the forefront of a lot of these interesting conversations. This book, Sand Talk, is How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, is by a native Australian person, and it looks really good. It just came out like 2 weeks ago. But I think that for me, this is just a part of my learning, and I just wanted to share it with you. I'm really grateful that there are starting to be more resources like this where indigenous people are sharing their knowledge and their take on things and what we can do. This is another book by Reginaldo Hazlitt-Medicine, who's the director of the Regenerative Agriculture Network. He is from Guatemala, was raised as kind of a peasant farmer, but then became an agronomist, and then moved to, I think he lives in Minnesota. And he's just a collection of essays about his childhood and growing up in that context with the militarization and the continued, displacement of people, U.S. interests. It's a very, very good book. Just a few little resources there.
So is this in the shadow of
Green Man, yeah. It's kind of like, he has these, at the start of every essay, it's kind of stories that he grew up hearing about Green Man, who was kind of like the jungle spirit. And then he's shared those with his children. So he kind of like ties his own story in with stories of Green Man. It's kind of cool. And then there's good old Bill. I keep coming back to this quote from Bill Mollison. As we start to think about what we can do, I feel like, as we all know, permaculture has a lot to offer. And we always, at least I always say in permaculture courses that I've taught, and this doesn't mean that everybody has to become a farmer, but the way that I think about this quote is that if we start thinking about ourselves as producers instead of consumers, it started to really annoy me whenever I'm like listening to NPR in the car and they're like, oh, the consumer price index is this and that means the economy is that. And I'm like, I'm not just a consumer. Just to be labeled that and to have the whole economic framework built upon how much me and other people are consuming is really just annoying. So I like to think about instead, as I've studied permaculture and agriculture more, a producer, and that's going to vary from year to year, but this year I grew a lot of figs and mulberries, and I had sheep with wool and lamb, and I also have camas and oats and acorns, and what do we have in our kind of stewardship realm to offer to each other, and to the land, how are we reciprocating? Is something that I think is really important to think about as well. And I mentioned getting to know the kind of traditional ecological land management systems of your area, our area. It's been an interesting journey for me personally. When I first came, I trained as a organic farmer. So that's my background is in agroecology. I learned how to grow lots of food, and in the kind of conventional organic sense. And so when I first got to our place, we planted a bunch of potatoes. We're like, we're gonna just grow all of our potatoes. We grew about 300-400 pounds. We're out there like rolling out the drip tape and having all this stuff, irrigating it, setting up the timer. Meanwhile, the land where I live has this huge patch of camas, which is just hanging out. Camas is a native root crop, staple crop, high in carbohydrates, high in potassium, really nutritious, and it doesn't require any irrigation. It loves the dry summers and wet winters. And at a certain point I was like, why am I running around like a crazy person just trying to grow these? I mean, it literally is a crazy making. It's like trying to do the same thing over and over again but expecting different results. It's a lot of work to impose the European agricultural model on this land where we need to pump water up from the ground and apply it on top of the soil to get many of these crops to grow. So increasingly I've been really thinking about that and trying to adapt my own eating and just yearly cycle around thinking about how that could be different. Oaks are another great example. All around us we have fat and carbohydrates that are literally falling from the sky onto the ground, but in the form of acorns. And again, they don't require irrigation. They do, however, thrive with a little bit of planned disturbance in the form of fire, which was the traditional management method, or grazing, to encourage just the continued nutrient cycling in the area. There's also many different berry crops around here, like salmon berries pictured here, but many of the berry crops were also cultivated and are still also cultivated by indigenous folks in the area. Salal is a big traditional berry crop. There's also so-called wild strawberries. There's many different native food crops in the area that we could be investigating and thinking about more as our resource base that are appropriate to this region, do really well in this climate. Some of the folks I've talked to, one of the things I know about camas is that Luther Burbank, who was a kind of famous plant breeder, was breeding camas and looking at it and he thought it would actually supplant the potato back in the day because it's so much more nutritionally dense. And he was breeding big bulbs. Some of them, I've dug some up around here that are the size of small onions. And they actually do well. They do better when you dig them. So when you dig up the big ones and you make room for the little bulbils that fall off to grow bigger and stronger. There's also a species like this critter here. Does anybody know who that is? Lamprey, yeah. I've just been kind of learning more about freshwater species in this area. The lamprey were and are a really important food resource for the Kalapuya people and many others. And to me, I think it's really important that we if we start to really think about our sustenance coming from our waterways and thinking about our land in terms of what it provides for us and how we can engage with making that more robust and thriving over time, it really kind of starts to change, I think, our mindset. You know, I think that it's been a big loss to not kind of appreciate what's here and what we can possibly do to make it more present. You know, we hear all these stories of, oh, the lamprey is going extinct, the freshwater mussels are going extinct. There's at least in the Willamette Valley, many of these species are threatened, but they're incredibly valuable, nutrient-dense foods. So if there are ways that we can engage and start to think about, well, maybe we need to get on the board of the Watershed Council and really start to think about our rivers and our creeks and all of these places and spaces that we can be working in to ensure that we have food. As we start to localize more and not, reduce our carbon footprint by not buying things from so far away, this is going to become a much more important facet of our reality, I think. I also think that, especially as climate change continues to intensify, looking at similar regions around the world that have climates analogous to what climate change projections are saying is going to occur in our area or in the area where you're from can be really instructive, especially when it comes to staple crops. And so around here, looking at, these are the cork oak silvopasture systems of Spain, the Dehesa systems, where oaks are kind of the overstory tree crop species, and then cattle, sheep, and pigs in various formations are grazed underneath their canopy. I think that's a really potentially viable system for our area, especially in this particular zone. I read a study recently kind of looking at climate change projections for the Willamette Valley. The Douglas fir is probably going to be not thriving or dying all throughout the Willamette Valley by 2050. So, and oaks are going to be more thriving in this area as it becomes hotter and drier. So more similar to the Umpqua watershed area. There's also the Araucaria forest in Chile. So Chile is an analogous climate to Western Oregon. And so kind of looking at areas around the world where we have similar climates, those really amazing monkey puzzle trees grow these really huge pine nuts. Probably have seen some of them growing as street trees or decorative trees around. One of those could be a food crop. This is a picture on the left, upper left there of apple forests in Kazakhstan. So where the original apples came from. Be kind of interesting to go there and do some botanizing and think about, what kinds of species would do well here as well. Down below is a chestnut tree in Sardinia, old growth. Again, kind of looking towards these species that do well in a dry summer environment, but provide really nutrient-dense food, especially fat, carbohydrates. Those tend to be the hardest to grow in a kind of garden environment, and protein as well. Olives for oil, also from dry climates. And then there's sweet potatoes in the middle there. There's something that I really want to see more of happening in the valley, just as we think more about our local sustenance.
What did you say between apples and olives? I got distracted by the
Apples and olives. Oh, chestnuts.
chestnuts.
Yeah.
And what's the reason?
Those are that's a picture from Sardinia, which is an island off the coast of Italy. But there are chestnut kind of cultures in France and Spain as well. And I'm not sure why half of my slide didn't show up here. On that note, I wanted to kind of move into thinking about our current commons, where we have these kind of leverage points to start thinking about and moving into more of a commons-based economic, political, ecological model. And there are some things set up already, and to some extent, they might need certain investments at this point to be more viable, or they might need more participation from people just showing up at their meetings, things like that. But I'll just go over a few of them that some of you are probably familiar with. Cooperative business models. There's an amazing example of a cooperative business in Spain called Mondragon that employs several 100,000 people in these kind of nested hierarchies of different businesses, but they all own it, and so they retain the profit. And I think that, just on that kind of level of our labor, the thing that in a wage economy you kind of sell your time, if you can maintain that, the value of that as a quote worker, that could be a really great way, to at least start taking back some of that power that we have as people. Land trust and alternative land access. This is a really big issue that I've thought quite a bit about as well. How are we going to move past the private property model? A lot of times the price of land is way unhinged from the value, quote unquote, that you can retrieve off of it as a small farmer. Like these days, it's really hard to even think about having kind of a subsistence-based reality in our current economic system, especially as a nuclear family. So kind of examining how to get land, and there are some interesting models out there. There's several different places where older farmers or landowners are interested in hooking up with people who are looking to access land. So things like the Rodale Institute has a really great website where you can just kind of plug in there, and farmers who are passing on their land have signed up on there, and you can meet them. I have a friend who did that really successfully out on the Oregon coast here. I think this month is finishing his last payment to a farmer. He got a 100-acre ranch. He did have to pay for it, but it was not at the market value of if that person were to sell it as real estate. So there are some unique arrangements there. Co-housing and eco-villages. This is something that for me has been this kind of tension point, because I live out in a rural setting as well, kind of just south of here, and I really value being able to be on land, but I also really like being around people and having those kinds of connections of help and assistance, and moving beyond that nuclear family unit can be really powerful. So if you do have the opportunity to move into or think about a co-housing situation, I just heard that Portland has recently allowed for, maybe it's all of Oregon, the building of accessory dwelling units on properties. So this is kind of expanding the possibility of more dense development in urban areas for sharing land.
Yeah. Washington just passed a resolution statewide for that as well.
That's great. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that, really make this possible, especially as we, more and more people are interested in this type of lifestyle. I wanted to talk a little bit about reparations and, how we can potentially go about rectifying some of the injustices that have happened and continue to happen to indigenous people, African American people, and the climate justice piece. I feel like there's so much there that really needs to be addressed. But I've come across a few different resources that have sprung up. One is Real Rent Du Wamish, which is based out of Seattle. It's a website that if you live in the Seattle area, basically what they encourage you to do is go on there and pay the tribe who has been displaced, if they don't have a land base there anymore. They've just been totally kicked out. And you can pay them for that because they were never paid for that. And so there's kind of these unique things that are springing up out of the technology to be like, well, okay, I'm going to pay a little bit of extra if you have that extra. And many people, have the privilege of owning land, may have that extra. So it's something to think about. Soulfire Farm, which is a farm in upstate New York. The founder, Leah Penniman, wrote the book Farming While Black, which is an excellent book. On their website, they have a reparations map, and so it's for all of North America, I believe. But you can look at the little pinpoints on there, and people sign up, and they tell you a little bit about their farm, and they tell you, their PayPal account, and you can basically just give them money. So it's kind of a way that you can find these farms owned by indigenous people of color and give them some money, maybe, or find ways, connect with them in order to volunteer. I've been studying a little bit about climate reparations. I've heard, my understanding is the past several COP, the climate conventions that have happened annually, this has been completely off the table. But many of the small island states and many of those countries that were in red on that map that I had posted earlier have been like, you know what, we're going to need some assistance here. The U.S. in particular has emitted 25% of the global CO2. We're responsible for that. We have 4% of the population. The people who have not emitted that CO2 are bearing the brunt of those effects. So how are we going to think about transferring some of that wealth to at least create formats for folks there to create their own adaptation and mitigation systems? I'm not an advocate of kind of big, especially like IMF type of projects. I just heard that in the wake of Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, the IMF came up with I think it was $119 billion loan as an aid package. And they did not erase any of their previous debt. And, this is the kind of thing, if any of you have read the book, Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, thinking about disaster capitalism, it's happening.
Yeah.
And, I don't exactly have an answer for that at this moment, but I think it's really important to be aware of these processes that are at work where, ostensibly, like the World Bank could have just given Mozambique $120 billion, interest-free. But, I guess for me, part of doing this talk, I'm just kind of wanting to encourage us to get active and organized around these ideas and principles, and see them for what they are, and hopefully come up with unique solutions. And talking about labor a little bit, one of the things about the enclosure process and that kind of dispossession of a more integrated village-style life was that everything became kind of the responsibility of the nuclear family. And that is, kind of perpetuated in our economic system to this day. And more things are becoming in the realm of money, from childcare to elder care to, everything in between, school, education, I should say. So we've been doing some cool things in our little neighborhood and community that have really been very impactful and helping kind of ease the burden. We've been, for the past just over 3 years, we've been organizing neighborly work parties in our community. So once a month, we have a rotating group of people who all have property in the Cottage Grove area, and 20 to 30 people show up at your place every month and just do whatever it is that you have on the table. You have a potluck, and a lot of work has been getting done. And so it's fun. You get to see other people's places and help them out. And it's a way to just socialize and have this kind of event. Also, in my small neighborhood, we've been doing dinner rotation, which has made this huge difference. Just with 3 households, one night a week, we cook for the 3. One family cooks for the others, everybody. And so for 2 nights a week, we have it completely off. No cooking, no cleaning. And it's been such a nice way to just relax. Because one of the things about this economy is that we're always having to do everything. And especially in the realm of this kind of non-monetized labor, the labor of household is it can easily be neglected, and then you get again into the ease of the money economy. Well, maybe you'll just go out to eat. There's these ways to make it easier that way.
Yeah, when you do that, do you deliver the food, or does everybody have to get together and it becomes a whole social night, or how does that work?
It depends. So if people don't want to stay, they just come with their Tupperwares, pick up and go home. So it just depends on how people are feeling. Yeah, there are small children involved, so it's people can be tired by the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, in West Seattle, there's a time bank where people trade time. They work in each other's yards, and it's really cool. But I also heard about where I see childcare trades there, where childcare time banks can be exponentially awesome because you can watch 8 kids at once, and you get 8 hours in the time bank for one for each child that you're watching, and so then you have a whole 8 hours for every hour that you spend watching 8 kids. So for people that have children, the time bank is a really great community resource.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Because it's interesting. I mentioned Sylvia Federici at the beginning. One of her big things has been, the folks that reproduce the workforce. She's kind of a Marxist, so she talks about things in terms of the material conditions and the workforce, which is the next generation. That's how they call it. That labor is so immense, and having anything to support that in place can make a huge difference. Sylvia Federici. There's some great interviews with her, floating around the internet. Another thing I'd point out is the existence of mutual aid societies that kind of sprang up in the last century, at least in the U.S., around people in a Grange is an example, the Oddfellows are another example. These were places, at least the Grange, were places where farmers were feeling the need to have a space where they could get together and talk about the things that affected them. So it was kind of this commons approach. They figured out, should we go in together and sell all of our cotton at this price, or corn, we could use help harvesting, in this way. They've kind of fallen in disrepair, over the past 2 decades, although there's some that are still pretty active, but they are this kind of network and infrastructure that we have available. Yeah.
I didn't want to talk too much. But there, and down in Santa Cruz and places in California, Sebastopol, the permaculture community has taken over the Grange halls and have enlivened them, and it also comes with a bank account.
Yes, that's awesome. I'm not sure if you...
Please, what if...
Yeah, there are a couple of examples in Santa Cruz, California, and Sebastopol where the permaculture community has come in and taken over the Granges. I've been to the one in Santa Cruz and it's awesome. They have a beautiful garden, forest garden outside, and they are these spaces that exist with beautiful hardwood floors and conference centers. You can show movies there.
And it came with a $40,000 bank account.
No,
They just joined the Grange.
Wow. See? Yeah.
Repeat.
You want to know.
Came with a $40,000 bank account.
If you want a cool Grange, you don't have to go farther than Lowell. I was a member of Lowell Grange when I was living here. Thank you. And it's not just hippies, it's all the community. But like the wood shop teacher from the Lowell school whose kids build things and sell them is also an organic farmer, cider and cattle, and he's a member.
Awesome.
And so it's a really happening Grange.
That's great. And where I live, there's one that's kind of up and coming. There's also where I live, the Oddfellows Hall. If you look around some old towns, there's all of this infrastructure. The Oddfellows in Cottage Grove have this 3-story building. Most of the members are 80 plus. But there's been recently more people of the younger generation joining and just making use of their space. You have to put on a costume sometimes, and they have like secret handshakes. It's worth it. Just to have a space to gather that's outside of money exchange. That's another thing that you probably noticed walking around. There's very few spaces where you can go and kind of meet up with people. That's not like going out to the bar or going out to eat. Just to have this kind of public venue can be really meaningful. Also, just talk about some of the things that are going on. Water. There's been some endeavors to grant personhood to rivers. That's happened in New Zealand and Chile, as far as I know. So legally, if something happens in terms of like mine tailings being dumped into the river actually has the right to be represented in court. Bolivia just declared that nature itself has rights. And I've been involved in the community rights community in Lane County around the banning of aerial herbicide spraying. And that movement for community rights, communities to determine what can and cannot happen in their areas is really powerful. And there's been many different examples in the United States and beyond already where communities have come together and banned fracking or banned coal trains from coming through. And instead of going through the traditional legislative process, petitioning and getting your representative to do what you want, you essentially just create an initiative, get enough people to sign it, and then ideally it goes on to the ballot for the wider population to vote on.
And then you have a lot of court proceedings. But, they're trying to do that in Lane County.
Yes.
But you have to keep fighting for it. It's ongoing.
Yeah, especially ones where the corporate interest is pretty heavily not in your favor as a community, as is the case with the aerial herbicide spraying. The court battle has been protracted and continues in Lane County. Yeah.
How, in that sort of situation, would you prevent like a standing rock situation where I think the community in that area, like in an area close there, was like, no, we're not going to have a pipeline through here, but then they're like, oh, we'll just route it through on a obviously standing rock reservation. Like,
Yeah, so that was a really interesting example where, you know, they kind of did, I don't know that it was a community rights initiative to not have the pipeline there, but it was, I mean, my understanding of it at least was that it was kind of like, no, NIMBY, not in my backyard. Maybe the back channels of political power made that decision. And yeah, I think that it brought up some huge inequalities because essentially, you know, the Standing Rock, the people there couldn't decide to do that, to, you know, put it somewhere else either. So that's where, you know, this kind of tension point of what are we going to do when our methods aren't working comes into play. And that's, you know, a conversation for the Grange Hall.
The herbicide thing with forestry, that's been happening since the mid-70s. And it's a really long story involving, like, especially Oregonians for food and shelter.
Yeah.
And it's still happening every election.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's some
If
lots.
anybody wants, I can give them a download, but it's lengthy.
Yeah, so Rick was just mentioning the herbicide story is a long one, and he'd be happy to tell people about it. It is a very interesting history of that in Oregon, and it's very entrenched. I just wanted to add a few more on there. Just ways that we can start kind of conceptualizing these changes and acting on them in our lives. One of the things that I've become involved in is disaster preparedness. Cottage Grove, the town where I live, is fairly conservative. And we've been really, there's a group of us who have been kind of organizing around the climate strike and just kind of talking about political mobilization in general. And how to kind of reach people. And we really felt like disaster preparedness is something that we can offer or just be more visible and part of in the community. As permaculture folks, I feel like we have a lot to offer in that regard. And so making a disaster plan or just kind of being involved with that in your community can be a way to really kind of highlight some of the things that a more whole systems approach has to offer. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you kind of skipped over, but neighborhood associations, a lot of cities have neighborhood programs. Becoming involved with your neighborhood association, you can take over your neighborhood association and turn it into a platform for permaculture. And I wanted to mention that I don't live in Port Townsend, but everybody in Port Townsend knows about Local 2020, where the locals are collaborating with the county emergency preparedness and taking that into a much more expansive and ambitious kind of a direction, not just preparedness, but permaculture stuff. Look up Local 2020 online and you'll find out what's happening in Port Townsend. It's pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I'll just mention a few of these things for pointing out that I skipped over this. You know, there are these kind of smaller or more regional scale political bodies that are maybe potentially more available to us if that's something that people are interested in engaging with. My husband, Abel, in the 2018 election, our friend just emailed us and was like, hey, there's a write-in candidate for the Soil and Water Conservation District. Do you want to be the candidate? And he was like, sure. And I just posted about it on Facebook, and 400 people voted for him. And he's in there. And
What? Really?
Yeah. I know. Yeah. And it's interesting because the makeup of the rest of the body is, most of the people are 60 to 70. They're older, conservative, like none of them, well, maybe one of them kind of believes in climate change. So he's been like bringing in literature.
We're down everybody 60 or 70 years old.
No, I'm sorry, but I'm just saying, like generationally, there is this kind of need to step in and engage in the political process is what I'm encouraging people of my generation and younger to do it and just, be in these spaces. At least for me, I hadn't ever really seen myself in this context up until recently. And now kind of like, oh, well, I could do that. Okay, I'll go sit in this room and, bring what I know to the table. And in a way, I don't want to end on this cheesy note of democracy is just going to work for everybody, but I do feel like there is definitely a place for us to engage more on that level, and if that happens, we could see things shift maybe more quickly. It's not so much like a them over there that are doing things, it's us. We're those folks too. Yeah.
How do you feel about Andrew?
I watched the last debate. I haven't followed him that much, so I don't know.
I'm finding that what he's saying and what you are saying have a lot of parallels.
Oh, cool.
Very
He wants lots of nuclear power too.
No, he doesn't.
What started?
We're not going to talk about politics. I'm sorry. I just wanted to point out something that is coming down the line that we may all be interested in participating in, lending our voices to, is geoengineering of the climate. So this is something that I didn't really realize was so much on the table. But apparently, I just read a few days ago that Bill Gates is throwing down a huge amount of money at Harvard, in conjunction with Harvard, to start studying the effects of strategic aerosol injection. So this is sulfur dioxide being injected into the stratosphere to reflect incoming sunlight. So that if we reach this tipping point of temperature and the ice caps start melting more quickly than they already are, it's going to be all hands. I mean, there's a lot of people that are on board with this already. And I was just watching the proceedings of a recent climate conference. I think it was even 10 days ago. And, they were like, oh, regenerative agriculture, blah, blah. Oh, aerosol injection. It was a big topic of conversation, and it's kind of to some extent, unfortunately, with a lot of scientific advances, people are like, well, if we can do it, we're going to. And we're going to just try it out. But this is going to be something that should be very concerning. For one thing, it doesn't do anything about carbon. It doesn't do anything about ocean acidification.
Well, there's that.
It does potentially reduce the temperature short term. You have to keep doing it. It's a short-lived.
And somebody's going to make a lot of money doing it, right?
Exactly. But it'll also maybe make it so the ozone hole gets depleted. We don't have blue sky anymore. Things like that. Yeah.
But another example of geoengineering is the Branson Prize, right? It's carbon sequestration, big prize for that.
Yeah,
So
it's called a
that's geoengineering.
forest. Can we get
There's some existing technology available for that. I'm not familiar with that, but
Oh, yeah, it's a big prize Richard Branson's put out to find the best method for carbon sequestration.
awesome. I mean, I think that there are other kind of movements afoot like that are, people are really activated around this all around the world, from scientists, policymakers, etc. I just think that this is going to be kind of a bigger thing, and the question of who decides the temperature, who's got their finger on the thermostat. Yeah, not to mention the side effects of sulfur injection.
It's very acidic.
Yeah, exactly.
So
It's very acidic. It was the thing that, stopped. We had to put all those scrubbers on the coal power plants to stop the acid rain because they were emitting sulfur dioxide.
I wanted to mention a couple of other things that are interesting where where a group has figured out how to leverage one little thing into much, much bigger changes. I know someone in Seattle who joined her local Buy Nothing group, and she has this big, beautiful garden. And at a certain point, she said to a couple of neighbors who were in the Buy Nothing group, oh, if you bring over some extra vegetables in a quart jar, I'll make soup and I'll send it home with you. And the Buy Nothing group has turned into a neighborhood-wide, making the intersections safe, making parks for kids, and they do this stone soup group twice a week, and they do clothing exchanges, and I know a number of other projects that are similar, where one little thing that just gets neighbors talking to each other has turned into a way to talk about the much bigger commons.
Awesome. Thank you. Did everybody hear that? I wanted to pass the mic, but I
If you
don't
missed
think
it,
it like.
join your local Buy Nothing group.
Yeah, the Buy Nothing group in Seattle has totally transformed the neighborhood into kind of a multi-level sharing cooperative. So that's exciting. Did you have something?
Oh, yeah. And sorry, we left the topic a little bit, but it might be of interest to the room, of course. Aerosol injections in the atmosphere have the side effect of reducing crop yields, which would be bad for us, I think. I just wanted to say two other fields of comments that might be worth considering real quickly. I think one that's vastly underestimated is just energy production, and that may be housed in labor, but it's very important. And then of course a second one, which I think really overlooked perhaps by permaculture communities, is media, culture, and information. I worry that this movement isn't growing as fast as we would like it to, and of course the faster it grows, then the more resources we have to draw upon. And people in dominant culture are actively colonizing our minds through media and information so that we're more interested in Big Macs or whatever the case may be instead of sustainable agriculture. And so I think engaging in local newspapers, zines, and other ways to get this information into the general public is really important.
Thank you. Did everybody catch that?
What about education on that list?
Yeah, so that was on one, and that's something that I'm quite passionate about myself as a parent, and I feel like it's really incredibly important that we're thinking about ways to engage youth in land care and skill building, and really rethinking school, I think, is a huge part of our culture change, like creating spaces where youth can be engaged and be learning about actual skills for life in our emerging world is incredibly important. And mentorship with various adults and other, multi-age group situations can be incredibly valuable. I could do a whole presentation about schooling. I think it's a big part of our issue right now is that, we're just kind of warehousing kids for the most part in schools during the day, and then when they graduate, they come out into the world, and they're like, this was this. I know that was the case for me. I turned out okay, but I really would have loved to be engaged in something during the day, just watching older people do things and seeing myself as a part of that community.
Yeah, I'd also, not only youth, adults need education, but I did one elevator speech with a senator in California one time. I said, I believe that everybody, especially in decision-making positions, should have some kind of form of permaculture education. It doesn't have to be a full-on PDC, but cherry pick to start getting people to start thinking about some of these systems and create, workshops or in-services or whatever, even an evening talk or something for especially decision makers, but everybody.
Yeah. I feel like if there are going to be state-sponsored schools and institutions, they should all be integrating this as, core. And that, if you work in education, I'd love to talk more about that because I feel like it's such a huge opportunity and challenge right now.
What's dual power?
Well, dual power is an idea that kind of encapsulates a lot of these things that I've had on the last two slides, where when in situations where the state and institutions aren't necessarily meeting the needs of people in the way that they would like them to be met, people just start kind of self-organizing in these ways, and eventually there's almost like the state becomes obsolete, or you don't really rely on it in the same way. So you can kind of think about this idea of mutual aid and helping each other meet your needs, rather than kind of having your community members have to go out and get wage work and buy all their food and pay for their these things where we can step in with our own human empathy and power to supplant some of these things that have been kind of created for us that may not be ideal. So, yeah.
Do you have a question? Well, I just, I'm in part of this local NAACP environmental group committee, whatever, and they are starting to have this resilience subcommittee, and it's more in response to disaster preparedness as the dominant society talks about it, and they don't have anything in it about agriculture and permaculture, which I'm going to bring up at the next meeting, but I'm not quite sure how to go from just suggesting that. What groups can I suggest we work with?
In
This
terms
is in Eugene.
So, like,
I mean, I can bring up the subject, but then I don't have a plan for it. What do we, how do we work, how do we get that on the agenda?
well, I could come to a meeting.
That's what I was wondering, yeah.
But there's a lot of local folks in the room here who would be interested in helping out or contributing to that conversation. I just got the time card back there for about 5:30. So if people want to go, feel free. But I was kind of hoping this would turn into this kind of conversation. So if you want to keep building our power here, we can do that too. So thank you.